Hello and welcome to the Talk Diaries with me, Tanya Beckett. I'm very pleased to have with me somebody who I've talked to many times, not just over the years, but over the decades about many things, but primarily Japan. And we're going to explain why it's important to talk about Japan in a moment. Seijiro Takeshita is now Professor of Management and Informatics at the University of Shizuoka, which is, I understand, also Takeshita, home to Yamaha and also Suzuki. So a place of great innovation.
Absolutely, and Honda was also with us, but they've basically fled away to Tokyo. But we are the third strongest manufacturing base in Japan, so we're little known, but we're doing a pretty good job, I think.
It seems like it. It seems like it. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is an important moment in time to talk about Japan. Certainly throughout my career as reporting on business and economics, I would say that, we always talked about Japan as to make yourself feel better, look at the graphs upside down. It was one of those ones where the economy really was just flatlining, and they had an aging workforce and an aging
Mm,
population, which didn't
mm,
really help. If you counted that in, that probably was Japan was doing better than we thought, but nothing seemed to get the economy going. And now we seem to be a bit of a turning point. So
mm.
explain to me, if you would, what happened, why it was so hard to get going, and why we might now see things moving.
Well, it took such a long time for us to really alleviate ourselves, get ourselves out of this bad debt problem that we had and the pop of the bubble. And that basically caused a lot of very long-term deflation, obviously leading to lack in demand. And as you just noted, at the same time, there's been acceleration of ratio of senior workers in Japan, which meant the productivity started to go down. And considering the conservativeness of Japanese companies, what they did was they basically did not raise their salaries, in fact, for over 20 years. And there's been, decline of full-time workers, which basically led to the consumer sentiment going down. So we had all these multi-factors, which basically resulted in this, well, not only structural, but also some of the failures and policies that were implemented. So this is a reason why we've been lagging behind. But the reason why we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel is we do have a new leader, Ms. Takaichi, who is very outspoken, is very clear, who talks about policies and not politics. She wants to be Ms. Thatcher a la japonais. So, it's very, very clear that she wants to straighten things out. So that's giving a lot of hopes to the Japanese. In fact, 70% of the Japanese population supports her, which is a number that I haven't seen since Mr. Abe.
Okay, so who also tried using fiscal stimulus, pumping money
Mm,
into the economy and so
mm.
on, but she's talking about underlying reform. Is that it?
Yes, underlying reform and 20 trillion yen, which is criticized, but it's a right amount of investment, not too low, not too high. And at the same time, she's trying to create growth into the economy. And I think she's learned from the mistakes that ECB had made when they were trying to deal with the problems in Southern Europe. So I think she's taking the right steps. She's trying to basically put a jab in the arm of many of the Japanese companies to start spending a lot more. We're very much behind in digitalization and also globalization as well. So these are the areas I think which will continuously see growth coming from the Japanese corporates.
So when you say behind in digitalization, what do you mean by that? I mean, that we associate Japan with many things, but one of them is cars, and that's an industry which is really digitalized. So how is this affecting the economy?
Well, basically, as you just noted, we're considered to be very high tech, and we are in producing things. But the way the corporations or the society is being managed, we're very much delayed as far as digitalization is concerned, and particularly globalization. We have a word called Galapagos phenomena, which is, as you know, an island in middle of Pacific. And we have that for our technology as well, where we tend to create wonderful technology through process innovation, but then when we realize we're just kind of left behind as an island, this has happened in our technology. For example, in case of mobile phones, etc. So, basically what we need to do is increase the site of being a lot more global to comply with the demand of the world rather than Japan itself. So these are the areas where the Japan or the Japanese corporates have been pretty much delayed as far as digitalization and globalization is concerned.
So you're suggesting that really the thinking is sometimes a little bit insular. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Conservativeness of the Japanese corporates are great in one sense, but excessive conservatism basically prohibits, product innovation to come through. Again, we're very good in process innovation where we tend to improve, existing products. But when it comes to like something that's close to invention or transformation of structures, we're very bad. We tend to be excessively conservative. So, these are the areas where top management really has to push and change. But unfortunately, because of, I would say, the way the Japanese personnel, elevation is constructed, it still is, particularly amongst larger companies, a very excessively conservative methodology that is adopted in its managerial tactics.
And do you think that's partly because the population is older?
Absolutely, because what tend to happen is that we don't really introduce meritocracy, meaning that seniority is one of the factors of being elevated within an organization. So this is one of the factors which is delaying or people excessively sticking to status quo. I'm not saying that our system is bad. Again, we are very good, as you noted earlier, in making cars, making electronics, what have you, because we're good at process innovation. If you look at, patents over 100,000 people, we still are number one in the world, believe it or not. So we're doing a pretty good job in this area. But when it comes to transitional stage, you need a strong leadership to change, alter the direction. And this is where our weakness really shows.
Interesting. Okay. So what we're talking about now, though, is Japan's economy growing at what pace do you think? What kind of predictions would it be fair to put on? And I'm trying to set up why this might send shockwaves through the rest of the world. So what pace might the Japanese economy grow at in 2026?
Well, it's probably going to be somewhere around 1 or 2%. The reason for it being is because there's too much ambiguity factors, especially with the United States and also with the geopolitical tension with China, which is resulting in a lot of economic issues as well. But at the same time, I think what we have to realize is that Japan is very vulnerable to import prices, and we're getting, weakening the yen, which is exacerbating this situation. So obviously, it's a good news for exporters, but at the same time, we have to realize that inflation is here for the first time in almost 30 years. This may basically put a very sour mind to the consumer who are starting to feel good about spending, because if you look at the actual real income, it hasn't really increased that much.
Right. So yes, inflation has been pretty much absent, hasn't it? And what you were saying is it's appeared on Japanese shores, but not for a good reason, really, not for a
No,
positive
no.
reason.
Certainly not. That said, our inflation is cost push inflation. It's not like demand pull inflation like the United States or United Kingdom. So the stem of inflation isn't as deep. But at the same time, we import 99.9% of oil, et cetera, and on goes the list. So obviously, it's hurting the household of the Japanese public and also the corporations eventually. So, this is one of the ambiguity factors that is definitely there. And this is one area where, Ms. Takaichi and her regime is trying to tackle at the earliest moment.
Okay. But if you have inflation and
Mm,
interest, and that there's talk about interest rates, in fact, they have already gone up, haven't they?
mm,
A little bit. But the yen is weak. Now, normally when interest rates go up, you would see then in
mm,
tandem with that a strengthening of the currency, basic
mm,
economics. But that isn't
mm,
what's happened.
mm.
So my question is why?
Well, it's the basic economics that you just noted, because if you look at the interest rates, that's true. Bank of Japan has raised its interest rate. But that said, if you look at the deviation between the United States, for example, on real interest rates, US is still much higher. It still remains to be high. And at the same time, I think the market participants probably knows that, the perpetuity movement of Bank of Japan to raise interest rates isn't there, meaning that the Japanese economic revival isn't as strong as to basically continuously raise the rates. So those are the factors I think that is leading, along with a lot of technical issues, which includes issues like carry trade.
Yes, let's get to that. So, the idea of the carry trade, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that
Mm,
interest rates are very low in Japan. And
mm,
so it makes sense for investors, foreign
mm,
investors, to borrow
mm,
money in yen
mm,
and pay these low interest rates and then
mm,
invest it elsewhere and get better returns.
mm.
And how long has this been going on for? Quite some time, presumably.
Yes, some speculate that there's probably like 40 trillion yen worth of
Wow.
amount that's been stacked up. We know that, the real demand is only 10% or less. 90% is, I call it speculative arbitrage because it's not against the law, but at the
No.
same time, it is a very speculative movement, not coming from the fundamentals. But at the same time, as you noted, yes, it has been a very big driver of the yen weakening condition. What I think most people are quite worried about is when this turns around, which we've seen twice in the past, actually three times, it could cause a very, very strong reversal trend, meaning that yen will strengthen substantially in short amounts of time, which basically would cause a havoc amongst everybody, because obviously, acute movement of foreign exchange rate is something that, most corporations or anybody that's engaging in economic activities hate to see.
Yeah. So if you're borrowed in one currency, if you've
Mm,
borrowed in that currency and it rises in value, then it's more expensive to pay it back. That's the point, right?
mm,
So my
mm.
question is, 40 trillion, did you say?
Yes.
That's a rather, that sounds, so 40 trillion what? What currency?
Yen, yes.
Yen. Okay. So how much is that in dollars about?
Well, that's about $250 billion.
Mm.
But when it starts to unwind, what tend to happen, and what we saw in the past, like in 98, when LTCM basically went bust,
Yes.
and also in 2009, 2008, when we saw, Lehman crisis, what tend to happen is that, the Fed basically decides to lower their rate, which means that what we talked about before, which is the real interest rate deviation, is going to reverse. In other words, the yen, or I should say, the Japanese currency or interest rates will basically be higher than that of the US. Then you see a reversal of carry trade. That's the mechanism. And what tend to happen is like in 98, what happened was that the yen strengthened by 20 yen in just 1 week. And I remember that in the Lehman crisis, the yen strengthened also by 20 yen in just 4 months. So, this would basically cause so much havoc amongst the market participants, even those who are in real demand or whether you're being a speculator, it doesn't matter. It just involves everybody that's in the market.
Hmm. Okay. So when we're on the subject of lending, the other thing that's very interesting, I've always found very interesting, is that I think I'm right in saying that Japan has the biggest investment in US treasuries
Mm,
outside the
mm,
US.
mm.
Right? So so who's buying this US government debt?
Well, basically, it's the Japanese government, and obviously, it's also being induced by many other, investment companies. I mean, we have $1.1 trillion worth, which is, I think, 13 or 14% of the total UST bill, meaning that we're the biggest, creditor to the United States.
Yeah.
But, there's a lot of, I just say, people who have, and I wouldn't say anxiety, but who wants to basically diverse their, international portfolio. So the first thing they go for, of course, is T-bill. And also from the political or say geopolitical point of view, sustaining a high amount of UST bill does fit, the Japanese policies in many sense, considering the
Mm.
fact that, we have a very strong security worries or issues with China and possibly with Russia as well. And basically, we need to sustain a very good, strong relationship and help support their position of sustaining hegemony against China, especially in various areas. So from that point of view as well, holding on to this, T-bill, many people suggest that, Japan should use this as a card, but I think that's really dangerous. It's playing with fire.
Yeah. So the idea there is the T-bill, as you say, so US government debt. If you start,
Mm.
any country started dumping it, then that would cause problems for the US government. That's the point.
Yes, but it
So
would
it's
cause a
sometimes a
problem.
political move.
Yes, yes, I agree with you. But at the same time, it would cause havoc of the international market as a whole. So
Yeah.
I always use this expression, selling off T-bill, at least in a substantial amount, is basically like spitting to air that is facing against you. It's
Yeah.
going to come back to your face.
Spitting into the wind.
So
Yeah.
yes, so from that point of view, I think one has to be very careful in trying to utilize this as a card. I know a lot of Japanese politicians are starting to say that we should use this card against Mr. Trump, who had been quite unreasonable to say the least, in his, requirements against Japan. But, one must also realize that we have 130 US base here in Japan. And, basically that is also the reason why, we're not getting, invasion from China or at least to that point. So, I think from a security point of issue, I think sustaining this 1 trillion yen worth of UST bill is, I think, a kind of a cement relationship, for Japan and US in various issues, including security measures.
So no knee-jerk reactions is what is what you're advising there. Okay, while we're on the subject of government debt, Japan has been in, I think it's fair to say, recent decades, very indebted. But the
Hmm.
reason people say that this is not a problem, because we worry about this in Europe and also in the
Hmm.
UK, but in the
Hmm.
context of France as well,
Hmm.
and other European countries, is that
Hmm.
in Japan, that debt is held to a large extent, at least locally within Japan.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so when we talk about selling debt, the Japanese have no interest in just dumping that debt or causing
Hmm.
problems,
Hmm.
and that's why it's thought to be safer for
Hmm.
Japan to be, or the Japanese government to be
Hmm.
indebted in the way that it is, right?
Hmm. Well, that's true, and I don't disagree with that. I think you've eloquently expressed,
Thank you.
the situation. But I always say this. People always say that, Japanese government debt is like, wife borrowing from a husband or vice versa. And what I always say is there is a thing called divorce, guys. And Japanese government is not something that is eternal or anything. As long as they still have a trust from the Japanese public, then that's okay. I'm not going to, try to cause a very negative image because again, if you talk about, the net debt that people talk about recently, a net debt, which is basically subtracting, the Japanese government's substantial financial assets, like, stock and bonds or, something
Mm.
that could offset the liabilities. You know, our, you know, our debt goes down approximately 100 to 130%, depending on how you define these in financial assets. And also, if you look at, in my opinion, the best item to watch this is looking at CDS swap, credit default swap. And if you look at the sovereign risk premium there, Japan is lower than that of US, way lower than Canada or France, which you just mentioned. So, it's not something that, again, we should just sit down on the couch and forget about. But it's not something that's immediately going to hit Japan in a very negative sense.
Okay. Good. So we've talked about debt. Let's talk about old people.
Hmm.
We worry in, Europe about an aging population and what that means in
Hmm.
terms of supporting that aging population. And we
Hmm.
wonder also where AI is going to play into all of that. So let's
Hmm.
just start with Japan. I mean, I have heard economists say, well, everybody's been so negative about Japan, but if you look at the fact that the workforce is shrinking, actually it's doing quite well. So just talk me through, if you would, why an aging population might be problematic and how Japan is coping with that.
Well, I still believe that in Japan, we're not utilizing enough women, for example, and we're not
Women.
utilizing
Did you say women? Yeah.
women, and also the older generation as well. We still have a strong prejudice against gender or age. That's my opinion. And we still haven't utilized these wonderful workforces, to its fullest. Now, from that point of view, I think a change not only in regulations, but change in minds of people. is also utmost necessity in order to solve this problem. And as you noted, introduction of AI and utilization of that, I think, will be a very, very big help. Of course, this is a serious problem, and it's we're going in the area where nobody knows. So this is very much of a scary scenario, but at the same time, it's challenging. But I think as soon as we have the psyche change about utilizing senior citizens or women or even foreigners, we're starting to change on that gradually. I think there will be some methodology at least to mitigate these shocks that are coming through.
But another thing that we can learn is there is a huge amount of thinking and practice around staying healthy when you're older. I mean, older people are only problematic if that sounds a terrible thing to say, doesn't it? But if they're not healthy and if they're not productive, but if they are both of those things, it doesn't matter how old you are, it's a number, right?
Absolutely, that's the whole thing. In
This is
fact,
this is what I'm pinning my hopes to here,
no,
Sejiro.
no, no, I totally with you 120%. Myself, I'm a professor, but we have a retirement age of professor, even if you get tenureship in Japan. And
Really?
on
Okay.
goes the list. You have people who retires at 65 who are excellent engineers, and guess who hires them? A competitive Chinese company, for example.
Right.
And all the secrets and all the technology goes over. I mean, these things are happening, and I think the Japanese delegates start to realize that there are still very healthy people, very able people, as you just noted, who should be utilized. So, but in order to really accept that, I think societal change, societal values really have to change because, again, it's not only the top management, but a lot of Japanese society themselves are stuck in a methodology of status quo. So, this is one area where they really have to start to realize, about, utilization of human resource in a much more wider and varied way.
Mm. Well, Sejiro, it will be 2026 will be a pivotal year. I think it's fair to say for Japan.
Hmm.
Would you agree
Hmm.
with that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of external ambiguity that's lying ahead, both in political,
Uncertainty as
geopolitical.
well as ambiguity, right? Yeah.
Oh,
Mm.
yes, yes. I think ambiguity might have been a little bit of a politically correct word.
Yes, we're past that here. Well, thank you very much indeed for sparing time to talk to us on the Talk Diaries and for sharing your insights. Sejiro, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.